Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman. How's it going, Pat?
Going great, as
Good.
well as it could be going under the circumstances, but
Yeah,
all good here.
it's crazy times. Well, we have we have our good friend Aaron Maté, our first recurring guest, I believe. Aaron was actually our very first guest on Unfettered Speech.
Yeah, almost a year ago now. Yeah.
Aaron probably needs no introduction, but he's a reporter with The Gray Zone, an independent investigative news site, probably one of the best sources of information that you can turn to. He also writes a Substack. He's also finishing a book on Russiagate and hasn't been doing a lot of media, so we're especially grateful that he agreed to come on. So thank you, Aaron, and welcome.
Good to be back.
So let's start with what's going on in Iran. So it seems like we have a ceasefire that lasted long enough to spur a run on the stock market. And there is a dispute regarding Lebanon because Pakistan, whose prime minister I believe is mediating the discussions. He indicated that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and immediately Israel started a massive bombing campaign, bombing civilian infrastructure, killing families in southern Lebanon. So what is the state of the ceasefire? Has it completely blown up? What can you tell us, Aaron?
Well, as you said, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, when he announced the ceasefire, this was right before Trump's 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline of Iran to capitulate, or else he would wipe out Iran's civilization. 10 minutes before that, the Pakistani Prime Minister said that there was a ceasefire brokered and that it includes Lebanon. And he went out of his way to name Lebanon, which says to me that he knew that Lebanon would be a flashpoint and could possibly blow up this deal. So he wanted to stress that Lebanon was off limits to Israeli attacks. And when he said that, I didn't see any pushback at all from the White House. No one in the White House said that this is not true, the deal does not apply to Lebanon, which strikes me as confirmation of what the Pakistani Prime Minister was saying, especially given that there is reporting indicating that the U.S. helped draft the Pakistani government's talking points on the ceasefire. It was only when Israel ignored the ceasefire and started going on a rampage in Lebanon, hitting more than 100 targets in about 10-minute span, mostly, in fact, entirely civilian targets, killing well over 200 people, and going after areas that they usually avoid, including in downtown Beirut, which usually gets untouched by Israeli attacks. When Israel attacks Lebanon, it's usually in the south, where there are many supporters of Hezbollah, and which is closer to Israel's border. And so it was only then that the Trump administration started saying, well, no, it does not include Lebanon, and J.D. Vance started mocking Iran for insisting on Lebanon, and he said it's dumb for Iran to do this, even though he said that we insist on having our allies included, which is Israel and the Gulf states. So if the U.S. insists on having Israel and the Gulf states, why can't Iran insist on having its own ally? And another contradiction was that we constantly hear that Hezbollah in Lebanon is a proxy of Iran. It does Iran's bidding. They're inseparable. And then now all of a sudden, J.D. Vance was saying that Iran has nothing to do with Lebanon, so why should they let the ceasefire blow up over it? So the messaging was incoherent, and even CBS News reported, it's CBS, which is run by Barry Weiss, who's very pro-Israel, even they said that Lebanon was part of the initial ceasefire, but that only changed after Trump and Netanyahu spoke on the phone. So what I think happened was simply Netanyahu saw a new opportunity to try to blow up the ceasefire, and he went after Lebanon, hoping to draw Iran back into fighting and blow up the ceasefire, because Netanyahu's goal is what he promised Trump would happen very quickly when he sold him on this war, which is regime change in Tehran, and that has not been accomplished by any stretch. A lot of civilian infrastructure was blown up in Iran and Lebanon and surrounding Gulf areas, but regime change hasn't happened yet. So Netanyahu, seeing that that's his only long-term goal, tried to blow it up. Since then, as we're recording this, it looks like the Trump administration has pulled back. JD Vance said that Israel is going to check itself in Lebanon, whatever that means. So maybe we'll have a reduction in Israeli attacks in Lebanon. But as of now, the plan is for JD Vance, Witkoff, Jared Kushner to meet with Iranian counterparts in Pakistan. And I think that will happen. But the question is, once they meet there, what are they going to talk about? And what can this Trump administration conceivably agree to, given that they've had no interest in diplomacy so far? And in fact, every time they've engaged in diplomacy, they've used it as a cover for more aggression.
They've actually used it as a cover for murder.
Yeah.
So, but how about the oil, Aaron? What do we know about is the Strait of Hormuz open for anyone except Iranian allies, or has it been opened in the last couple of days? Because I see conflicting things on that.
As we're recording this, Trump is just complaining about Iran charging tolls for ships to pass through. And Iran has said that it will be open, subject to technicalities being worked out. I mean, it's a complicated process, coming out of a war, and still the unchecked Israeli aggression in Lebanon. But Iran has said that yes, they are open to letting there be passage in the Strait of Hormuz, but they want to charge people now because they have a lot of damage to try to recover from and infrastructure to rebuild. So they said that that is their new position, that ships passing through will be subjected to some sort of toll, which they will split with Oman. That's the proposal they've laid out. And given that it's not as if Trump will ever agree to give reparations to Iran for all the damage this war has caused, I don't see Iran backing down from that demand.
Wasn't that one of the 10 points anyway?
Yeah, it was. It was. And Trump said that this was a basis for further negotiation. So he seemed to accept it, at least as a starting point, or at least not as a deal breaker for now. But then you have more conflicting messages because you also had the White House press secretary say that Iran put forward a plan that we just threw in the garbage.
Yeah.
So you have a really incoherent administration that Trump. All the reporting shows that Trump really was acting on a whim here. That it's not as if he was even surrounded by principals who were gung ho about this, with the exception of maybe Pete Hegseth. There was some skepticism inside the White House, but Netanyahu, according to a recent report in the New York Times, came to the White House Situation Room in February, sat across from Trump, as if the two were sort of co-equals, and sold him on this plan that the government in Iran would fall very quickly. Israel would activate its cells there, foment regime change, kind of like what happened in 1953 with the CIA coup in Iran, where they activated their own assets there on the ground and fomented unrest, and Mossadegh fell. And it didn't happen this time. But what was also interesting about that New York Times article, in fact, I think the most revealing part, and again, you have to take all these reports with a grain of salt because now they're based on, now there's an interest inside the Trump team to portray, people inside the White House as being skeptical of this and pushing back and not being on board because it was such a disaster. So maybe this is some people just trying to engage in, repairing their image, especially J.D. Vance, who wants to run for president one day. But if this part is true, I find it the most revealing, which is that Kushner and Witkoff, when they sat down with the Iranians right before Trump started this latest wave of aggression and killed the Ayatollah and killed all those schoolgirls, that he spoke to Witkoff and Kushner and Witkoff, contrary to what they later claimed, told Trump, yeah, we probably actually can reach a deal, but it will take a few months. And so if that's true, then Trump's own negotiators, despite their later statements, were saying that actually, yes, a deal with Iran is possible, but Trump, because of, a lack of an attention span and interest in diplomacy, didn't want to wait 2 months for some sort of resolution. So he decided to go on this bombing spree instead and blow up the world economy, and I think his own presidency in the process.
Aaron, I'd like to go back to what you said about Israel's goals, because, so you said regime change. What does that mean exactly? Does it mean a puppet of the U.S. and Israel who's basically going to turn their head and not see or not interfere with their treatment of the Palestinians. Is that what that means? I noticed that Netanyahu recently was quoted as saying that Iran is weaker than ever, and this is not the end of the campaign. It's merely a preparation on our way to achieve all of our goals. So how is it possible? I mean, Trump may sincerely want to end this conflict. How is it possible with a partner that wants to keep fighting and basically wants to see the destruction of Iran or the installation of a puppet regime? And it doesn't seem like that's in the cards. So how is this, how can this have a favorable outcome?
Well, exactly. It can't, as long as you're treating Netanyahu as essentially your co-president, as illustrated by having Netanyahu come down to the Situation Room and sit there across from Trump and sort of lead this presentation on why he should go to war. As long as that's the dynamic, you won't have peace. Israel can't coexist with its neighbors. It's for all of its existence, it's attacked its neighbors, stolen their land. Just as we're recording this, a top Israeli minister has talked about grabbing more territory in Lebanon, in Syria, because they feel biblically entitled to this land. And a government like Iran, even though Iran is not a neighbor of Israel, because they support regional actors like Hezbollah, which can somewhat deter Israel. It can fight Israeli forces on the ground, as we've just seen in these recent weeks, where Hezbollah, despite many assessments, and to my own personal surprise, fared pretty well on the ground. And Israel called off plans to steal a lot of southern Lebanon because their forces just couldn't dislodge Hezbollah. And so when you have a government like Iran in this massive country, as we've seen now with this war, I mean, this is a huge country. This isn't like Syria or Iraq, previous regime change targets. This is a massive country, and you just can't go and have regime change with a few weeks of bombing infrastructure. First of all, it's had the reverse effect when it comes to galvanizing the Iranian people. I mean, Netanyahu, I think, in his arrogance, believed that people would come out in the streets and protest the government. They've come out to support the government, as we've seen from the footage that we get every day from Tehran. Even amidst the bombing, people were out there cheering on the government, defending, because people, despite whatever grievances they may have with their government, they always defer, I think, to their sovereignty and protecting it from foreign aggressors, including the case of Netanyahu and Trump, who are vowing to wipe out their civilization. That has a rallying around the flag effect. So back to your question, as long as Trump is listening to Netanyahu and his delusions about regime change, and yeah, the goal for Netanyahu is to cause enough misery in Iran that the people turn on their government and the U.S. and Israel can install somebody who is compliant.
Just to jump in, and then I'll have Pat ask a question, but you mentioned 1953, and it seems like Iranians, they studied history and they've learned something from that. And like you say, it's not happening this time. But why would you think it would? I mean, there were so many voices that if you listen to from Iran that said it's not going to happen. People that predicted exactly what was going to happen. That people are going to rally behind the country, and so.
There's a lot of reporting that Trump felt emboldened by Venezuela, where, from his point of view, it was a great success. No Americans were killed in that operation. And it's true. And they had cooperators on the ground who, turned on Maduro. And now Maduro's sitting in a New York prison cell. And Delcy Rodriguez is following Trump's orders because she's essentially a hostage. Her country is held at gunpoint. So he was emboldened by that. And you also had Syria, where, I mean, that worked. It took a long time, though. It took more than a decade of the CIA spending billions of dollars arming an al-Qaeda-dominated insurgency. It took crippling sanctions that hollowed out what was left of Syria's economy. And it took a U.S. military occupation, which happened to be parked right in the parts of Syria that contain its most valuable oil and wheat reserves, which were denied to the Syrian government to make it even weaker. So perhaps they felt emboldened by all these previous successful regime change efforts, and they thought that after decades of sanctions, very widespread discontent inside Iran. There's no doubt about that. Conditions are very tough there by design under U.S. sanctions, as multiple top U.S. officials have bragged about. I mean, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, he was giddy in describing that he helped crash Iran's currency, and that helped spark the the protests that began in December. And you also have, there is corruption in Iran. There is a sense that, the rulers are not suffering the pain that the people are. So they thought that all this discontent, all this suffering could lead to what the U.S. has previously achieved in other regime change efforts, which is just people turn on their government and submit to the U.S. and Israel. It didn't happen this time because, as you noted, Iran has a long history, and the history includes previous, U.S. destabilization attempts. And people not only don't forget the coup of '53, but they also don't forget that the U.S. took the side of Saddam Hussein
Right.
against Iran in the 1980s. The last time Iran faced attacks of this scale were the 1980s, when the U.S. was supporting Saddam Hussein, including
Supply the materials for chemical weapons as well.
yeah. Well, I mean, everybody. I mean, it's amazing what Iran faced back then, because Iran not only faced the U.S. giving Saddam intelligence for those attacks, but European countries were giving Iraq the materials for chemical weapons, and the Soviet Union was too. So Iran was facing literally everybody. It was facing both the Soviet Union and the U.S.-led bloc, and it still persevered, and it wasn't defeated, but that came at a huge cost. And so when you go through things like that, it builds up historical memory, and it builds up fortitude, which we saw on display in this latest round of aggression.
So let's talk about the media environment a little bit. We started out asking you just factual questions because it's sometimes hard to understand what is actually happening, because there's so much just garbage out there, right? In terms of what the mainstream media is putting out is often untrue or full of omissions. Like you mentioned the Iranians coming out in support of their government, and one really kind of stirring thing was when they were standing on bridges, right, just a few days ago,
Yeah.
ready to be bombed if Trump was going to take that approach. It was not reported, I think, in a lot of the corporate press, and certainly not very heavily. And Trump's deranged Easter Sunday tweet was not shown on Fox for at least a couple of hours, and it was only paraphrased after that, but not shown in its entirety because it's unhinged. So people don't have a lot of information. Like you mentioned, the New York Times. What you can glean, as you kind of alluded to, what you can glean from that New York Times article is the fact that it exists. Not necessarily that everything in it is true, but that it exists. It all shows that there are people who are trying to position themselves so that they can, have credibility when this disaster is finally wrapped up, right? So that's where you would run to tell your side of the story, the New York Times, and leak against your administration to preserve yourself. Okay, that's what that's for. Is everything in it true? Maybe, maybe not. But I mean, Leonard said before we started that this conflict shows how important independent media is now. But it's also even harder to sort through all the misinformation and the half information. How does a reporter do that, and how would a consumer of information even understand what's going on?
Well, this war to me was unique because the administration's case was so lazy and so incoherent that even a normally subservient, that even a normally subservient U.S. media couldn't whitewash this one because the contradictions were just so glaring. I mean, you had Marco Rubio come out and say that the reason the U.S. attacked was because they knew that Israel was about to attack, and therefore, when Israel attacked, Iran would retaliate against U.S. forces, so the U.S. had to go first. And then he lied and pretended he didn't say that. And you also had, meanwhile, Tulsi Gabbard going before Congress and under intense questioning, having to admit that the U.S. intelligence consensus that Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons had not changed. But yet John Ratcliffe, sitting right next to her, lied through his teeth and said, yes, Iran was working on nuclear weapons. And the other argument was that Iran was building up a ballistic missile shield to one day safeguard their future nuclear weapons program, and we couldn't wait that long until they did that, which was like, it was like a form of fan fiction, like as if Iran's basically building this impenetrable Death Star that we have to act now to destroy. So the lies were just so incoherent, and the propaganda was so lazy that you saw, I think, for the first time that I can remember, actual pushback in the media about the rationale for going to war. The first time I can remember seeing that. Oh, not because I think suddenly reporters got and editors got like a jolt of integrity, but just because the propaganda on the Trump administration's part was so lazy that if the Trump administration is not going to make an effort to sell this war in a serious way, then how can the media do it for them? So you saw, I think, more pushback on the rationale for going to war at this time than I think normal. But what you didn't see, for example, you still don't see, is when it comes to the kind of atrocity propaganda that we always get in every single war about why we have to go and kill a bunch of people is because if we don't kill a bunch of people, then we're going to let the targeted government kill a bunch of more people after they've already killed a bunch of people. And in this case, that was the narrative of the massive numbers of Iranians killed during the January protests. And the numbers have fluctuated. Like Trump is now saying it was 45,000 people killed. And if you watch CNN or MSNBC, whenever someone throws out a number, whatever it is, whether it's 10,000 or 20,000, 30,000, that's never, ever challenged. So in terms of atrocity propaganda, a narrative used to manufacture consent for war, that part still is unchanged. And it's only if, outlets at the margins like Gray Zone and others that have challenged that. And you dig into the numbers where they come from, and the sources wildly fluctuate. And there are always groups that have an interest in regime change and even a financial interest, if they're funded by the U.S. government, which has been the case with some of the sources here. So you still will not see that one challenged because, if you look at all the major wars, Libya with Gaddafi is going to commit genocide in Benghazi and is distributing Viagra to his forces. Syria with the chemical weapons allegations. There's always a Hamas in October 7th. There was the mass rape allegations, which are still not challenged in establishment media, despite ample reasons for challenging them. You always have a narrative that's just too big to fail. That people in media understand that if they challenge that one, they'll be marginalized. They'll be called an apologist for the targeted government. So some people won't go there, and that's the case still with this crackdown on the protests, even though it's also been admitted, and the Times recently reported this, that Israel had plans to activate cells inside Iran to foment unrest, to foment riots after the bombings. And Trump even said that we armed protesters. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Trump said it himself that we were sending
Yeah.
guns into
Yeah.
there. So
Yeah.
again, to talk about that incoherence, it was on the one hand, we have to save these people, but we sent guns in there, and to the extent that they were being killed, they were, shooting at the authorities. So what would anyone do if they're being shot at, if in fact any deaths happened, but we don't even know if that happened. Everything in the messaging of this has been completely incoherent, including if you want to protect these people, we have to obliterate their civilization and kill them all in order to protect them. So it didn't line up even to an average observer, I don't think.
No, it didn't, and that is unique because usually when these wars happen, the propaganda is so effective and it is sophisticated. It works very well. So you do usually have public support. Like Iraq, when Bush went in, he had public support, and most of these wars do because the propaganda it's uniform. People stay on message, and people fall in line. I mean, I've seen this where even working in leftist media where leftist outlets have a hard time challenging pro-war propaganda sometimes because you don't want to seem to be defending, atrocities or excusing them, and that's a natural human impulse. But the problem, everyone always has to ask themselves, like the problem is that either a claim is true or it's not. Either there's evidence for it or it's not. And this time, it was just easier to ask, is there evidence? Because the propaganda was so sloppy that media just were forced to do their jobs, maybe despite their behavior in previous conflicts.
Yeah, it does seem like the propaganda is not working as well this time, but the narratives are still out there, like you say, Aaron, and that is, there's people that still believe we're doing this to help women in Iran because they're mistreated, or that Iran is plotting to kill all the Jews. Just to give a plug for the Gray Zone, your partner Max Blumenthal recently traveled to Iran and did a report. In fact, he was on our show talking about his visit. First of all, he visited Jewish communities, and including synagogues. And I should mention that Israel just blew up in a Jewish synagogue in Iran. And he also talked about there were very few places where women had to even wear head coverings. So there's, I encourage people to look at that. And then there's your most recent Gray Zone Live, which you can watch on YouTube. I think it's called War Crimes Day. You had on two independent journalists that just returned from Iran. They visited the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it was an amazing interview. So I just encourage people, to, as Pat was saying, where do you find the truth? Find people that are actually on the ground in these places. And we really, our hats off to you guys for doing that and going to these places. The other thing you mentioned, I just want to maybe shift to, you mentioned people positioning themselves. What about the Democratic Party? I mean, it's like you hear some people come out and say and criticize Trump for this rhetoric about destroying this ancient civilization of Iran. Okay, that's wrong. But now they're sniping at Trump for even considering a deal that would allow Iran to remain in control of the Strait of Hormuz. So basically, they're, on the other hand, they're encouraging them to continue this war and continue the bloodletting. So what about the Democrats? Where are they on this, Aaron?
I think the first thing to say about the Democrats is that they delayed a war powers resolution. Putting before Congress the question of, does Trump have the authorization to go to war? And they could have pushed for that to happen earlier, but they kept delaying it. And that says to me that they wanted to use this war as a political weapon against Trump because they saw that it was unpopular. And I think they calculated, accurately, that the longer it goes on, the worse it will be for Trump and it will help them in the midterms. Politically, you could see the utility there, but the problem is, in the meantime, a bunch of people get killed and the global economy gets destroyed even more. And Democrats seem to care more about how they could use this for their own political hopes than what is best for the country and for the world, which is, again, it might be politically sharp, but morally it was totally bankrupt. It just shows a complete lack of principle. And you can see the lack of principle in how some, as you indicated, Democrats have responded to this ceasefire, where Chris Murphy, for example, who was, pretty vocal against the war as it was happening and saying he would not vote for Trump's supplemental request for $200 billion to continue this war of aggression against Iran. Chris Murphy sounded disappointed because it left Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz, which happens to be in Iranian waters. So he seemed upset. And Chuck Schumer, leader of the Senate Democrats, who, by the way, was opposed to Iran's nuclear deal, so took the side of Trump when Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal because Chuck Schumer had voted against that nuclear deal. So presumably Chuck Schumer is closer to Donald Trump on this than he is to Obama. But Chuck Schumer also, his critique of Trump was that the war ended and several outcomes are negative, including that Iran's nuclear ambitions are unchecked. That's what Chuck Schumer said. So Chuck Schumer is endorsing the fake narrative from Trump that Iran has ambitions for nuclear weapons, when even Trump's own intelligence agencies say otherwise. So Schumer, in opposing the war, or Schumer in acting as the opposition, was still endorsing one of the key narratives that Trump used to wage this war of aggression. So that's the Democrats. But you have people like Ro Khanna, who I think have seized the moment and have spoken with clarity and conviction, and reached out to Republicans, reached out to Marjorie Taylor Greene, and said to people in the MAGA movement that, hey, I mean, you were promised no more wars like this, and your president betrayed you, so come on in. So I think Ro Khanna has seized the moment. But as he pointed out when Trump announced a ceasefire, that Democrats abdicated their responsibility. That the ceasefire was no thanks to Congress, which just didn't live up to the moment, as Democrats always seem to do.
What about what's going on in the UN? Is there any action related to this conflict?
Well, you could say that China played a pretty key role here, that on top of Pakistan, which was a broker, that China pushed Iran to accept this. And I mean, that's what I've heard from people with knowledge of the behind the scenes talks. That's what I've heard. And it makes sense given how important Iranian energy and the energy that passes through the Strait of Hormuz is to China. That if this war continued for a lot longer, then China would have suffered some serious consequences. So China played a role here, and at the UN, China and Russia vetoed a measure the other day, right before Trump's deadline, his civilization-ending deadline. Uh, China and Russia vetoed a measure that would have basically condemned Iran for closing the Strait of Hormuz. So they acted with some backbone in terms of defending Iran. And this is after China and Russia, I think, made the inexcusable decision to basically hand Gaza to Trump with the so-called Board of Peace resolution, where uh, this measure that basically says that Gaza is now ruled by Donald Trump's so-called Board of Peace. China and Russia let that pass, and I just couldn't believe they did that, given that the resolution not only handed over control of Gaza to Donald Trump, even after he leaves office, by the way, if you, according to one interpretation of the text, that like Trump is basically now Gaza's ruler for life as long as he wants to be. Russia and China didn't veto that, all them, and which is all the more inexplicable to me because the measure also completely ignores decades of previous UN resolutions which affirm that Palestinians have the right to self-determination. And the text was worded even to undermine that. So China and Russia on this issue finally, I think, grew a spine and backed up Iran here. And I suspect that that veto that China and Russia did was a part of their efforts to get Iran on board with this. So I think here you saw more activity. And you also saw European states saying that, sorry, Trump, this is not our war. And after they've acted as vassals for so long, and given their dependency on the U.S. because of NATO and because of the Ukraine proxy war, where they've cut themselves off from Russian energy, so now they're even more dependent on the U.S. So they grew a little bit of courage here too, partly by saying that they were not going to participate directly in Trump's war in Iran.
What about, as we're talking about what really happened, what didn't really happen, was there a pilot rescue in your opinion? Or was that a cover story for a uranium grab?
I don't know. I don't know. I've seen the speculation that they were trying to extract the uranium and it didn't go well, and so the pilot rescue was just some what was a diversion. I don't know. And I've tried to speak to people inside Iran who might know something, but I haven't heard back on that yet. So I don't know.
There was an interesting article in the New York Times. You know, this is kind of back to Pat's point about, you know, sometimes they're forced into the light by circumstances. I think it was today about, basically it made the point, is this the United States Suez moment, talking about the Suez Canal and how that was seen to be as sort of the end of the British dominance over geopolitics. In addressing that issue, what do you think is the future of U.S. bases in the Gulf? What are the point of those bases in the Gulf? The New York Times seems to say in this article that they're there to protect sea lanes and to protect commerce. You could also look at them as a way to basically surround Iran and on behalf of Israel and make sure that Iran never rises to challenge Israel. So take it where you will.
Well, a lot of these bases came in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. And so the rationale then was that, you know, given that Saddam had threatened Kuwait, that U.S. military protection was necessary. But I think the real reason is, as you say, to surround Iran. And if you listen to people like Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton talk, they'll talk about constantly how Iran is a threat to our U.S. military bases in the region. So Iran, just by existing in its current borders, is a threat to surrounding U.S. military bases.
Apparently that is true.
Yeah. But I also think the bases are there to protect the ruling monarchies from their local populations. The U.S. offers a sort of protection racket there. Now, every country is different. I don't want to say that, you know, in all these countries that the masses, that everyone's against the government. You know, there is I think, some popular support in some of the Gulf countries for their governments. It's not uniform, but in Bahrain especially, or in Kuwait, but especially in Bahrain, where you had in 2011 an Arab Spring uprising, and it was crushed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia because the majority of the population there is Shiite, and they despised their ruling government. I mean, that's very clear. I mean, you had footage emerge in the early days of Operation Epic Fury of U.S. military bases being hit in Bahrain, and citizens there filming this and cheering. And from everything I know about Bahrain, that represents, I think, a broader sentiment where the population is just not on board with the ruling monarchy. So I think that's the main purpose of these bases: to protect the governments from their people if there's unrest, and we saw that happen in Bahrain, and also to threaten Iran, as we've also seen during this war. And some countries have made decisions that I just don't understand. If you look at Qatar and Oman, they've tried to play both sides. They clearly do not want to be on the front lines of a U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, and they tried to negotiate an end to this. Both of them did. The UAE, they're hostile to Iran, and they've called openly for this war to continue, for the government to be overthrown. And I don't understand strategically why they've chosen that, especially given their vulnerability. They're right next to Iran. Iran can damage them a lot more than they can damage Israel or the U.S., but they can damage the UAE, as they've shown. But the UAE's rulers have made the decision that they despise Iran so much that they're willing to act as essentially as foot soldiers for the U.S. and Israel. And they've shown that also with their investments, a lot of money going into the Trump family via the UAE. So that's the decision that they've made. And so if there was ever any popular uprising against that, the U.S. military is there to protect the government too.
If I could just ask one follow-up, because we're talking about what is it? Nothing that you said about those bases had anything to do with American interests. So, wouldn't we be better off? How does any of this help? It costs a lot. It costs U.S. taxpayers a lot of money to have all this presence in the Middle East, and I don't see what we're getting out of it. Obviously, they're very vulnerable when a war breaks out, especially with modern weapons. So, wouldn't we be better off? Maybe this is a question for Chaz Freeman, but wouldn't we be better off having diplomatic relations with Iran, having an embassy in Tehran, rather than spending billions of dollars to surround them with bases that are completely vulnerable and really don't seem to serve any purpose?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll disagree in the sense that there is a purpose, which is that if you control the energy reserves coming out of West Asia, that you have huge leverage over the global economy, right? And so that's always been the goal. That's what the U.S. gets out of this, is that.
But we don't control them. That's what we're learning.
Roger demonstrated, yeah.
Well, we control access to a lot of them, and Saudi Arabia has a huge amount of oil reserves, and trying to take Iran was the next step in controlling even more. I mean, Lindsey Graham openly fantasized about this, that if we can take Iran's oil, this will be great for us, and Trump has talked about that. So it's but what the U.S. gets in return for acting as a protection racket for these Gulf monarchies is control over a sizable portion of global energy reserves, not all of it, obviously. The ability to threaten a country that happens to have a lot of energy, Iran, and also all the money that is made by the Gulf monarchies gets recycled into the U.S. economy, and gets recycled especially into the U.S. Weapons industry. These Gulf kingdoms buying up all these U.S. weapons, and Trump loves to tout these deals that he always makes. So that's what I think is the financial interest, the strategic interest. But I think I don't even think it's mutually exclusive. Iran, I think, could tolerate coexistence with all these monarchies, even with U.S. military bases, just so long as Iran wasn't being threatened. So it's not as if the U.S. has to threaten Iran in order to have access to the Gulf. What Iran can't tolerate, and has resisted, is the Greater Israel Project of Israel denying Palestinians their freedom, self-determination, and stealing more land in the region. And that's what they've resisted. And because Israel's become so intertwined with the U.S. since 1967. The U.S. has been on board with trying to destroy Iran, and there's also just, I think, there's a sense of humiliation that Iran overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator in 1979 and essentially kicked out U.S. oil companies and said and turned its back on being controlled by the U.S. So they're just, when someone escapes your control and you're a hegemon, you want to bring them back in, and the military bases in the region are have been at least a tool to achieve that. But now, I mean, the question is, what is their future, given that they sustained so much damage, and given the inability of the U.S. to protect their own forces? It's just come out. CBS News just reported this, that forces in Kuwait were really upset with the position that they were in. That, contrary to the Pentagon's claims, the damage was far greater than admitted, and soldiers suffered worse wounds than were admitted, and people felt that they weren't sufficiently protected. And that underscores that Iran can strike against these U.S. military assets. And so, what is their future in the region? It is a great question. It's one of the big questions, I think, going forward. I don't have the answer to it, but I do think something has changed now in the aftermath of this war.
So let's look at February 27th versus today. What's better? What's better for the U.S. in any of this?
Well, if you're sitting in Washington in the White House, I guess you're happy that you blew up part of Iran's military and you blew up their infrastructure, their universities. So Iran will be even weaker and poorer going forward. If you're trying to achieve the long-term goal of regime change, then maybe this brings you closer 20 years from now. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of how they could spin this in a positive way to themselves, that Iran will have to spend a lot of money rebuilding, and will have less resources to, spend
Well,
on.
but let's look at the other side of the ledger. On the 27th, there was free access to the Gulf, to
Yes.
the Strait, and there's not anymore.
Yeah.
Iran was under sanctions. The big controversial thing was that Obama had allowed them to keep, I think, $1 billion or $1.5 billion. Now they're getting $100 billion a year through tolls. Well, let's just stop right there. The bases that you were just talking about are destroyed and very vulnerable, and whether they'll ever be rebuilt is a question. All that was fine on the 27th, and now we're in a whole new world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the oil, to my first question, isn't flowing. They say that it might, but Asia and Europe are days away from shortages and rationing and those sorts of things. So things aren't looking good for the United States compared to where they were on the 27th. It just seems like anybody could see that and go, this was a really, really bad move.
I totally agree. I totally agree. I was just trying to come up with putting myself in the position of somebody sitting in the White House trying to put a positive spin. What is the best case I can make? But, as you laid out, it's very difficult, because what did they achieve? And people around the world, they have no support for this whatsoever. The MAGA base has fractured over this. Trump has, as we're recording this, has put out this angry Truth Social post calling Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Megyn Kelly all losers. I mean, these are people who
They
helped.
were his allies. They
They were
helped.
his allies. Yeah. And
So he doesn't have those allies anymore. If you think of that side of the ledger, it's unbelievable. It's a disaster. And if we didn't even talk about this yet, but our standing in the world. I mean, even February 27th, or maybe a year ago, before Trump was in office, had we ever murdered a diplomat under a white flag? I don't think it was ever done. Had we ever started what's considered under the Nuremberg trials a war of aggression? I don't think we ever did. Arguably, we never did. Leonard and I were talking earlier. If you were a diplomat and you were asked to go to Islamabad or anywhere and to meet with the U.S. official, would you do it? Would you believe that you weren't going to be killed, or your family wasn't going to be killed?
yeah.
Did we used to bomb entire residential buildings to get one guy who we thought was a bad person, and maybe it was AI who told us it was a bad? I mean, the level of our moral standing in the world has collapsed. Of whatever you want to say about it previously, maybe it was never what we claimed it to be, but we've gone to a new level of piracy and perfidy and really just violating not even modern norms, but ancient norms about how war is conducted, how diplomacy is conducted. How do you come back from that?
I mean, it's a great question. I would only take issue with the sense that we've never launched a war of aggression before. I mean, I think many wars qualifies that the U.S. has launched qualifies that. But I agree that it's a new level of cynicism and deception. I mean, the as we've talked about how sloppy the propaganda was, they barely made an effort to sell this to anyone, and the open contempt for human life that Trump displayed. I mean, no president that I can remember, publicly at least, has ever spoken like that about wiping out an entire civilization. Civilization will die. That was just a level of cruelty that even supporters of U.S. hegemony couldn't tolerate because it's just so brazenly evil. And so, to your question, how the U.S. comes back from that, I don't know. It definitely feels as if the world has changed, and Iran, by not being defeated, even though they suffered a lot, and I don't want to sugarcoat that. A lot of their infrastructure, prestigious universities were destroyed, and there's a lot of damage there. But by not being defeated, they won. And what happens now, especially now that he's alienated part of his base, some of his most prominent supporters are now openly against him. This was a huge disaster strategically for the U.S. And Israel, meanwhile, was hoping to be emboldened to, not only have regime change in Iran, but oust Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's not happening either, because Israel's gone in on the ground, and I think they thought that Hezbollah would be, a lot easier to defeat, but they're not. Hezbollah on the ground has fought back, and so Israel's pulled back from its plans to take a lot of southern Lebanon. So they're as the U.S. and Israel now do, they're just venting their frustrations on innocent civilians by blowing up more civilian buildings for as long as they can.
And even for Israel, there were polls out, I think a Pew poll that said that 60% of Americans now have of all age groups have an unfavorable view of Israel. And Israel needs the United States' favorability in order to keep doing what they're doing. I mean, I don't think that a Ted Cruz can run for office next time and say my number one job is to support Israel. He'll get huge backlash on that didn't used to exist.
Well, certainly a Democrat can't do that anymore, and that to me is the biggest shift. If you look at polling in Democrats, I mean, the position of people like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries on Israel is now totally out of sync with their own base. And all the AIPAC money and trips to Israel can't wash that one away. They're going to have to contend with that. The Republican Party is still now, it's like, they do still have the alliance of like the, older Zionists, like, and also Christian evangelicals who are still behind the idea of this like militarized Sparta Israel, because that they believe will hasten the rapture. So the Republicans, I think, will have an easier time having a candidate who is unapologetically pro-Israel. But you're right too, because Republicans now listen to Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and that is a big part of MAGA, and that won't be easy. That won't be as easy to ignore. So you're right. Both parties are going to have a hard time being as slavishly pro-Israel as they always have been.
The relationship with Israel, that may be a big change that comes out of this debacle in Iran. I think more like both of you said, I think more and more Americans are starting to question that relationship. I think it's pretty clear that Netanyahu was a big part of misleading Trump. And, a lot of people think Trump is just lying all the time, but, there's another school of thought that people just know how to play him now. And Netanyahu, and apparently Lindsey Graham was coaching Netanyahu on how to play Trump and how to get him to do what Netanyahu admittedly has wanted to do for 40 years, which is an all-out bombing campaign of Iran.
Yes.
And I think people are starting to wake up to that, and I'm just wondering what you think the future is. I have a great uncle that had a famous saying that you can't make a good deal with a bad partner. And it seems like that's what America did here. They basically made a decision to go to war with a partner, and it's a complete disaster. I mean, right now Trump's apparently trying to end the war. I don't know if he's sincere or if he's just jacking up the stock market for one of his cronies to get to cash in. But it's a disaster, and he can't stop this war without Netanyahu. And Netanyahu says, "I'm not stopping the war. I'm going to keep fighting because our goals have not been achieved. We want a puppet state. We want
Or a
Lebanon
failed state, or a failed state, either one.
or a failed state, like Syria."
Exactly. The Iranian foreign minister, Arachi, said that basically, Trump has to choose. Is it going to be Israel or is it going to be peace and global stability? And Trump not wrecking his own presidency. That's Trump's choice. And everything is in line for him to just throw Netanyahu under the bus and say, Netanyahu told us things that were not true. They gave us false intelligence. So, we're done with him. And his base would cheer that. Like, he would face no political backlash whatsoever. His own party would fall in line because, MAGA is sort of a cult. They don't challenge the dear leader. So if Trump decided to just basically blame Netanyahu and throw him under the bus, he could save what's left of his presidency, and everyone could move on. Now, is he willing to do that? I doubt it. He's very stubborn. He doesn't like to admit defeat. He obviously has this bigoted hatred of Iran, the way he talks about them as animals, all this stuff. So in that respect, he seems ideological. But look, he does have to deal with the economy. And Kevin Hassett, his top economic advisor, he was on Fox News this week saying that, look, now that this temporary distraction, that's what he called the war, it's a temporary distraction, now the economy will be back on track because he's confident that his colleagues are going to make this peace deal permanent. So he was basically admitting that this war was a disaster for the economy. And that is one thing that the Trump team listens to. Trump is very proud of his supposed economic tutelage, stewardship, his great economic stewardship. So are they going to blow all that up for Netanyahu, who offers him nothing politically, except for Miriam Adelson's campaign money, which he already has gotten anyway? I mean, we'll see. But it's all there for the taking if Trump wants to seize the opportunity now.
Aaron, as you pointed out in one of your recent columns, Marco Rubio just went out and said, well, the problem is Iran, they have all these great missiles because they're spending all their money on missiles rather than on their own people. Well, Iran, they have health care. We were just talking about this earlier. I think Pat mentioned they actually have free college. Yeah. We don't have any of that. And in fact, Trump is saying we're going to spend the feds are only going to be concerned with wars. We're no longer going to be concerned with the welfare of the people. We don't have money for Medicaid or Medicare or daycare. So, I want to go back to one other thing that you said, and maybe you could comment on this. I know we don't have much time left, but Trump basically got elected saying he was going to be an anti-war, anti-interventionist candidate, and now we're $1.5 trillion a war budget. You mentioned that Trump doesn't want to admit he made a mistake by listening to Netanyahu, but it's not so much that he made a mistake. It's that he was duped, and I think that is hard for a narcissist to say. There was a famous saying, I don't know, it was Mark Twain, that said it's easier to convince somebody. It's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. And I think that's going to be the problem with Trump, is for him to say, yeah, I was a fool. Yeah. Listen to these people. I can't imagine Trump doing that, which makes me really pessimistic for how this is all going to play out.
Yes, and if Trump is asking for, as you mentioned, this record $1.5 trillion military budget, then he needs enemies to justify it. So a peace deal with Iran that would take away the antagonism would sort of undermine the efforts to push through this record $1.5 trillion military spending request. And by the way, just to underscore the point that you raised about Trump and his campaign promises, when he was running for president in 2016, he said exactly what Rubio was saying about Iran. Trump literally said that, imagine if we spent all this money that we're spending toppling foreign governments at home, we could rebuild our roads and our bridges and all the other problems. He was speaking along the lines of someone who did not want to spend all this money on the military and regime change and invested at home. And now, of course, he's doing the exact opposite. But how he could, if he wanted to, back down, it's true. He's not going to admit that he was duped or that he made a mistake, but he can claim a victory and said, Iran has agreed they'll never have nuclear weapons, which of course they've already agreed to a million times. And he could say we've weakened them militarily,
Right.
and everyone would go along with that one. Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, Iran did take a hit militarily, so Trump could say that and call it a day. That's the path I hope he takes. I don't think we're going to see some sort of broad agreement with Iran because that would take like effort. And who is Trump sending? He's sending Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner,
Yeah.
who have no interest in diplomacy. I mean, that's clear by now. And J.D. Vance, who might be more amenable to a deal, but he's not going to, like, are these guys capable of negotiating a complex nuclear agreement? No. Like the JCPOA that Obama's team broker took years, well over 2 years. And it's complicated. You have teams of experts, people who speak Farsi, people who are very knowledgeable about nuclear issues, which is not J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, or Steve Witkoff. So I don't expect some sort of grand agreement, but I do expect at best some sort of tacit détente where everyone just agrees to go their separate ways. Iran tries to rebuild what it can. Trump looks the other way as Iran charges a toll, and that's the way Iran gets compensated for the damage. That's the best case scenario here.
Well, it's funny that we should wrap up, but we've talked about it with other guests and other formats. But the idea of narrative and having a story to tell, and rather than the reality of the physics of the situation that you're in, if you go back to the 20th century, the 19th, or any century you choose, when people go to war, it's because politics failed. You have to use violence in order to achieve their ends, and they either achieve their ends or they fail to achieve their ends. Whether they say this or say that, there's the reality that you don't control this territory anymore. You are not in charge anymore. Who's charging a toll at the straits now? You can spin it this way or that way, but someone's getting $100 billion more that they weren't getting before you started this. And so it's interesting that we've talked to people who are sanctioned for saying things about the war in Ukraine, and they can barely live now because and the crime was saying a thing that's violating the story we want to tell. It's not about reality. And so here we are again saying like, okay, well, reality has gone all against us. It's a strategic disaster on every level. But hey, you know how you get out of this? Tell a story that people will believe, and just move on. And that's the world we're living in now. It's all narrative driven. It's just interesting.
I mean, it feels like the Emperor Has No Clothes was written for Donald Trump, because with him, it's so about narrative. There's never any admission of any kind of mistake, any acknowledgement of the other side and their legitimate concerns, no empathy for anybody, just pure narcissism and a series of yes men surrounding him and yes women cheering him on and calling him the greatest thing since sliced bread. But though, this has been such a disaster that the fact that you're seeing, as we've discussed, these reports now coming out saying that people inside the White House were skeptical and they weren't on board, but they all said, Donald Trump, like, we'll defer to you. That says that there's a recognition that this has been politically damaging for Trump.
And that there's a reality out. There's still reality out there. I still
there is.
reality. It's a little bit. I guess one analogy you can think of is, the Fuhrer in his bunker when he's directing non-existent divisions to go here and there, and finally people break it to him that hey, they don't exist. It's not. It's not happening. You can tell yourself whatever story you want. But anyway,
your microphone's not even connected. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Aaron, we always appreciate having a chance to talk to you. You're a voice for finding the truth and someone of great integrity. We appreciate everything that you're doing to get the word out and finding out what's actually happening. So And we know how busy you are with your book, which we're waiting for. And so we appreciate you coming on today and talking to us.
I appreciate you guys having me. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron.